Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos, and I am joined by author, researcher, comedian, Jay Dyer. How you doing today, brother?
What's up, man? So glad to be back with you. And as I was telling you before the show, really appreciate you having me on to discuss this because it's one of my favorite topics. Sam Tripoli is the only other person that's invited me on to talk about it. So, yeah, I love to nerd out about this topic. So I really appreciate you having me back.
Of course, man. That blows my mind because we were planning on doing this sometime the end of last year, but, you know, life and everything just keeps getting in the way. And I reached out to you after one of your 4th hours, and I was like, dude, you basically covered like this topic in brevity. It was like, I think it was like 40 some minutes. And I was like, dude, that was fantastic. That was so much stuff I had never heard. And you're like, oh, well, we should do a stream on it. I was like, yeah, absolutely. So I appreciate you and all your work and coming over here and kind of sharing some of your wisdom with us. So, you know, I'm going to be more of a person asking questions and prying into your knowledge because I tried to do some preliminary research on this topic. And I was wanting to reach out to you. Maybe there was a particular paper or something to read or specific books, but I was just kind of going through the internet and finding blogs and stuff. And some of what you mentioned was in there, but you had a lot more details. Where would you begin in introducing this topic? I mean, do you start with like Lawrence of Arabia, some of the earlier, where do you see this topic as sort of intro into
it? Maybe from the outset, I could recommend what some of the good literature on the topic is, because there's a lot, but a lot of people don't know what that is or where to find it. So some of the books are more recent. Some of them are a few decades old, but my entrance into this subject matter was indirect. It was through watching documentaries back in 2003. I won't say the documentary because it might trigger something, but Jason Burmis did a well-known documentary back then. And that kind of at first hipped me to Middle Eastern stuff. And, you know, I liked his history of England and British Empire stuff. So that's maybe my entrance into that subject matter was back then. But I would say even throughout the 2000s, I really didn't know a whole lot about it. And I'm not an expert. I wouldn't say I have like a PhD level knowledge of it, but I have a pretty good knowledge. And I read a lot of books on it. So I think I can speak to it. Probably the best introductory book for this subject would be F. William Engdahl's book, Lost Hegemon, because he goes into kind of the layout of the Middle East and the basics of the game plan from the West and from the competitors to the West, which were different competitors at different times. If you go back to the late 1800s, it's called the Great Game. And this is Russia versus the Anglo power, right? So it's the UK,
right?
What becomes the Atlanticist establishment during the Cold War. Lost Hegemon is a great place to start for understanding the background. Then I would say, for more specifically kind of what we're talking about today, Mark Curtis, who's a Royal Society researcher, he wrote a book called Secret Affairs, and it's a really good 500-page book. And I want to stress that most of the material that I'm referencing or talking about is not conspiracy material. So you'll notice, again, Curtis he works for the Royal Institute for International Affairs. Okay, so this is up near the top of the pyramid in the West. So it's not anything to do with, you know, outlandish theories or whatever. I try to stick to the academic literature on this topic. There's another really good book that approaches it not so much from the UK angle as that book does, but Robert Dreyfus's book, Devil's Game, is the next book I would recommend. And that book approaches the US's alliance with various factions and versions of radical Islam for the last 60, 70 years. as part of the Great Game, as part of the Cold War. And other really important texts too, I'll just mention in passing, would be probably Gauss Munier. That's Munier, Black Gold Spies. He's a French researcher and writer. And this is the last book I covered on the subject, and it was also really good. So this might actually be a better starting point for people who are into just the history of the British Empire's approach to the Middle East. And then some years back, I interviewed the authors Gould and Fitzgerald, who wrote the book Invisible Empire, which is about the history of the British Empire's approach to Afghanistan. So those are some of the starting point texts if you people do find this interesting. And then there's kind of a magnum opus mega work that's very difficult. And it's Stephen Dorrell's massive, it's about a 1,000-page book, History of Politics. And this comes at it from a very critical perspective. There's other texts as well, obviously, Tragedy and Hope, obviously, Anglo-American Establishment by Quick would be important as well. And then the Milner Fabian text by Johan Ratiu has multiple chapters that are very relevant to what we're talking about today. And this can just keep going on and on. I mean, you can get into the history of, Ian Fleming's life, and although it doesn't relate necessarily to Islam, it gives you kind of a window into, British operations and their approach to the Great Game, which is unique. It's earlier than the U.S. And for many people who may not be aware, British intelligence is who sets up American intelligence. So you can even go back to as early as the Inquiry, which is prior to the OSS, the first so-called intelligence establishment in America in 1942, under FDR and all that. And then we get the 1947 Security Act, which creates the CIA. We know of as the CIA. So British intelligence is who came over here and set that up for us. So it's a pretty wild story, but this is how we kind of get America doing what the British Empire did, as you pointed out, back to the time of T.E. Lawrence. So if you want a movie introduction to this subject matter, actually, yes, the Peter O'Toole famous movie where he plays T.E. Lawrence, the bisexual, or perhaps not even bisexual, perhaps just Skittles of the British Empire. But what's fascinating, and I'll stop yapping after this, and there's tons more books and documentaries, but one thing that's fascinating is how much of this relates to the establishment of the nation state of Israel. And this plays into the Balfour Declaration. This plays into the establishment of a Jewish state, which, believe it or not, many of the pro-Arabist British spies were very opposed to. And so there was a faction amongst the British elite, the Rothschilds and others, who favored the nation state of Israel being in the Middle East. And most of the Arabist British spies actually were opposed to this. And they said it was going to cause all these problems and wars. It was a powder keg. It was, unfair to the people that were there at the time. And even that was unfair to Jews who were being put in this sort of maybe less than desirable location for geostrategic reasons. So they're kind of like a chess piece, basically. So it's huge. It ties into oil. A lot of this has to do with oil and resource war. And that's what a lot of the wars are for, is resources.
Well, and so one of the things that I always found just doing preliminary research is that, and like you said, this is not a conspiracy. This is just facts that British intelligence has been noted multiple times of encouraging radical Islamic groups that are explicitly like anti-West. And when you bring up Israel, the whole narrative is that that's like a Western nation in the Middle East. And this is one of the reasons why they're such a great ally, is that they have all this cultural sympathies to us and the, expansion of the same sort of Western project. So why is it? And I think we already know the sort of false dialectic and everything like that. But regards to oil control, the expansion of Israel, how is it that British intelligence, when did they begin to really see, facilitating these Wahhabists and these radical Islamic groups as a geopolitical and strategic tool to actually gain power and expand?
Yeah, so if you go back to the period of the British Empire when it was beginning to kind of wane, you see competitors that they wanted to have every possible advantage against. So those competitors were France, Turkey, the Ottomans, and Russia. So you basically have these powers involved in a big game to control this region for multiple reasons. Resources are a huge part of it, hence the title of Meunier's book, Black Gold Spies. That's the oil, which once oil is discovered, that kind of becomes one of the main motivators for the British explorers and archaeologists who are the spies.
Right.
They're not really there to, learn the cultures because they just, now some of these people did love the cultures, right? They really did immerse themselves in the local traditions and the ethnography of these peoples. In fact, some of them may have actually converted to Islam. It's hard to know whether they really were converts or whether they were just doing it for their espionage cover, like St. John Philby. That's the father to Kim Philby, the famous turncoat Soviet spy who was a British operative during the Cold War, who, along with the other, famous Cambridge spy ring, went to the Soviet Union because they decided that most of them, by the way, were also Skittles men. So they were also compromised. And that was part of what the KGB was very effective in doing. The Cold War was compromising Skittles operatives. But regardless, way earlier than that, you had Philby's father as one key example beyond probably T. Lawrence is probably the most famous, but probably the next most famous would be St. John Philby, who went and he converted to Wahhabism. And he seems to have been pretty serious about it, even if it was spy cover. He did it really well. I mean, he donned the garb, he went full Wahhabi, and this was probably what was necessary for him to be able to strike deals with certain tribes and, basically help to set up what we know of as the Saudis. So the British Empire went in and they wanted to set up their men, put their proxies, pay off and have their tribal chieftains, right, running things. And this is what they did, not just with men spies like Lawrence and St. John Philby, but and there's many others, but also with women, which is kind of weird. There's a couple famous British Arabist women spies, and that might have actually been very useful precisely because they were women, because
Right.
the Arabs and the tribes might not have expected this lettered frail British woman to be a spy. But in the case of Gertrude Bell, Freya Stark, these are two pretty famous wealthy British women who ended up being British spies who helped set up in the case of Iraq, like basically they just chose, okay, it's going to be Ibn Saud and we create Iraq. Iraq is a created country by the British Empire, as is Saudi Arabia. And to get back to the main point, I'll stop yapping. One of the ideas was to control Mecca, right? So the British Empire thought if we could control Mecca, that'd be a huge positive for geopolitics in terms of how we manage and control Islam. That would be a blow to the Ottomans. And so once the Ottomans were falling apart, you have this secret deal called Sykes-Picot, and this divides up amongst Russia, France, and England, the Middle East. And this is kind of how we have the Middle East that we know today,
right, with
many of these countries kind of being creations of the British Empire. So you've got like Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. These are all former British areas. And it's not just the British. Russia and France tried the same thing. It's just that for whatever reason, the British ended up being the most successful in getting a hold of areas in the Middle East. And Napoleon tried it. The French tried it. The Tsars tried it. They just, for whatever reason, were not as successful as the British.
How close do you, so taking a step back in regard to the royal family in Saudi Arabia, one of the things that I saw, but I didn't see any citations, just looking, that they believe that the British intelligence was instrumental in placing them in power.
Absolutely.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's without question. I mean, it's just pretty much, that's the history. There's a movie that was just made that's not that great. but it was a decent movie presentation of what's in the Gauss Meunier book. Nicole Kidman actually played Gertrude Bell in the, I don't know if it's a Netflix movie or something, but it's like something like Woman of the Desert or something like that. It was an okay movie. It's a little slow, but it's fairly accurate according to what they relate about her history and her background. But yeah, so basically Lawrence was kind of the guy for, and Philby. They were kind of the guys that were doing the British Empire's operations in the Saudi Arabian region. And they just chose these tribal chieftains that they had the best rapport with and the ones that they thought, would be the most useful. And I mean, I don't have any proof of this, but I mean, I don't think it's accidental that they sent Lawrence in, who was, at least bisexual, if not just, and so because he could have been a very good operative for compromising people.
Right.
And if you think about, in terms of Islam, if somebody was compromised in that way with Lawrence, I mean, that would be the end, right? So that would be powerful.
That makes a lot of
compromise. But we'll also have to understand that not many people realize that Lawrence was operating at the behest of the Milner, Fabian, socialist circles of Lord Rothschild, Lord Milner, Cecil Rhodes, and his handler was a guy named David Hogarth, who was known as his, quote, spiritual father. He might have been his handler in more ways, if you catch what I mean.
Right.
I'm being serious. I mean, this is,
I believe it.
How this stuff works.
I totally believe it.
This is the real world here. But another thing that people don't know that's worth mentioning in regard to the Saudi stuff is that throughout the Middle East, they'd also set up quite a few Masonic lodges, and the Masonic lodges were also a means by which the British Empire was able to do a lot of intelligence work. They got a lot of information and intel through Masonic lodges, so that played a role, which not many people know about, but Meunier mentions that in his chapter on T.E. Lawrence. And basically, they just found that I think the key here is that it's not so much which ideology they like the best, but I think that what happens is the Wahhabi Salafi radical version is a great destabilizing force, right? So it's great as a kind of a cult means of controlling people, if you can control the tribal chieftains and the imams and all that. And it's great for destabilization when you need to use it. And this explains actually what the former head of Mossad recently just said in a massive interview on Al Jazeera. They asked him, why has Israel more recently been supportive of al-Nusra in Syria and the destruction of the previous Ba'athist, Assad secular type regime, nationalist type regime? And it's because it's a destabilizing force. Right. And that's nothing new in regard to what the former Mossad head was saying. This is just the old British strategy that these types of Islam are great for destabilization.
Right. That makes total sense. And one of the things that I saw, I was not totally surprised, but I thought was, oh, that's pretty interesting. Makes a lot of sense. Is I recently did a stream maybe a month or two ago on the city of London, and that being the sort of the second largest financial center in the world, and how it has this black market where all this money flows through. So if you have dirty money, you want to do business in London. And I found that, what was it? Saud Ramadan, he was like one of the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, that when he was leaving the Middle East, he had refuge in the city of London. And so him and a handful of Muslim Brotherhood radicals, they all once their gig was up, they just left and went back to London. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then you connect, the Balfour Declaration, the Rothschild money, and then the support for Israel. It's like very interesting how all that stuff circulates, and it takes you always back to London.
It does, and that's why people have called it Londonistan. It's because you have a very old lineage of linking, the British elites with Islam, and there's many reasons for that. A lot of it's tactical, geopolitical, as we've talked about in terms of the beginning of the Great Game, but it's also because many of the British elite structure, because of the imperial, because of the expanse of the empire, you have many people who were committed. They were Arabophiles,
right?
And so a lot of that elite power structure, for example, Gertrude Bell, who came from a very wealthy family, she, for whatever reason, just fell in love with all of that region. She was such an oddball as a woman, which is totally out of character, in the early 1900s. She goes to Iran and learns Farsi and starts translating Rumi's poetry, which is just really odd for that kind of a woman. And I think the movie version with Nicole Kidman actually portrayed that, even though it wasn't that great of a movie, it portrayed that pretty well. So you did have this faction and this group that really loved it. And I think more recently, people will look at, King Charles and, oh, look, he's given money to the Sufi orders, and here he is wearing the Sufi garb, and they'll act like he converted to Sufism. I mean, maybe, but I think from the vantage point of, somebody like him, religion is just kind of a tool for power. If you're the state, most people at that level are not perhaps ideologically committed. And so you want to use these groups when they're useful. So it doesn't mean you're necessarily committed to Wahhabism. It doesn't mean you're necessarily committed to Sufism. But those elements can be useful. I'll mention Muslim Brotherhood real briefly, because Muslim Brotherhood is a great example coming out of Egypt of a group that was created with some dubious origins. I think Al-Banna is a very suspicious character. If you look at Dreyfus's book, there's a great chapter on him. But they were a broader political activist movement that wanted to expand Sunni Islam into politics. And what's interesting about them is that the CIA and British intelligence, CIA, made an open alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood in the 40s and 50s because they saw them as a potential hedge against Soviets. So just like the British Empire might want to align themselves with, say, Saudi or other types of Muslims against Ottoman Turkish dominance, right? So you're playing one kind of Islam against another. Right. Same model goes on in the Cold War, where there was a period, if you read Miles Copeland's biography, where he says the CIA toyed with pan-Arabism or Arab nationalism. And so they actually supported the Baathists at one point. And this is why you can find those old images of like that Saddam had CIA support when he was early on a Baathist, and you'll notice like there's a picture of him shaking hands with Rumsfeld, right? So there's an old CIA linkage between the Baathists and Western intelligence. But what happened was when the Cold War kicked off, the secular nationalist Arab pan-Arabist movements were swinging more and more towards the Soviets. And so the CIA saw them as less of an ally and becoming more of a threat because they might get assistance from the Soviet Union. So that made the CIA then say, okay, now we're going to do this older British strategy. We're going to link ourselves up with the more radical factions and sections of Islam, hence the alliance with, in this case, Muslim Brotherhood in 1956. This is called Operation Straggle. And this was a joint venture of CIA and MI6 to use the Muslim Brotherhood to stage a coup in Syria. That coup was not successful, but this came about because one of these women who were British intelligence operatives that we talked about, like Gertrude Bell, there's another one named Freya Stark. And Freya Stark was a woman who was sent out to do reconnaissance for the British Empire throughout the Middle East. And she had made these contacts with Muslim Brotherhood figures. And Miles Copeland in Game of Nations says, we turned to TERROR because anytime Nasser gave us a problem, and he was a CIA consultant to Nasser. He says anytime that he gave us a problem, we could just say, well, you might have a little bit of a TERROR problem on your hand if you don't do what Washington and the CIA want. So you can begin to see how the game works here.
Yep. Classic problem, reaction, solution. So we've kind of discussed here a large history. Where would you pinpoint the beginning of British intelligence involvement with Islam specifically? Is it with T.E. Lawrence? I mean, where would, if you had to describe the beginning of this process, this phenomenon?
Well, I think for the modern world and the great game, it would be that. But I would imagine that I'm sure the British Empire had, Islamic connections going all the way back to, the time of Elizabeth and all of that. I don't know. So it's interesting when you go back to like that time period, there's less and less written about espionage exploits, going back into the 1500s and 1600s. But I would imagine, they had those connections back then. But for what I know about is just the more recent, post great game stuff, which, really the reason this is so important for us is that we're still seeing this play out now in the Middle East. Like the battles and the things that you see happening in the Middle East where, what Israel, I just did a live stream the other day about Lebanon, the CIA, Syria, Jordan, and, all that area around Israel. That's playing out because of the presuppositions of what the British Empire set up. So everything that we're dealing with today is rooted in the British imperial layout and structure. And this, for example, is why when Israel started to have wanted to exert its own power, I guess you could say, they were not happy with being a British colony. And so you had the Irgun, the Stern Gang. These are essentially organized crime factions who began to make moves to throw off British colonial rule. And there were different motivations and reasons why they did that. In fact, a lot of people don't know this, but they were actually split between whether they wanted to support the Axis, some of these Jewish gangs, or supporting the Allies. And one reason for that was they reasoned that, well, if the Axis powers were the enemies of the British Empire and the Brits, and we wanted to overthrow British colonial rule, maybe we should support those guys. This is the same reasoning why some of the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, also wanted to support Tiny Mustache Man. So, so just alliances of, enemy of my enemy is my friend, that type of stuff. But it was actually, the organized crime sort of Stern Gang, Irgun circles that become the nascent Israeli intelligence service. And people don't even know that. Guess who trained some of them? Do you know this? You'll never guess if you don't know. Quiz question.
I'm not sure.
One of the famous trainers of these people is a guy named Otto Skorzeny, and he was a high-level operative of Tiny Mustache Man.
Of course.
Isn't that crazy? That's just public history, right? So, and when when Tiny Mustache Man lost, just like Reinhard Gehlen, that network of spies that he had set up for Tiny Mustache Man, that all became just immediately the property of the CIA, right? So we have all heard about Paperclip, right? But Paperclip is also the CIA taking over Reinhard Gehlen's spy network throughout Europe, Gehlenorg, and one of those nascent networks is that network in Germany is now called the BND. German intelligence is literally Gehlen's network that the CIA just took over after the Cold War, because they gave him a deal. They said, you can go to prison for the rest of your life or death, or we get your spy networks and we don't kill you. So that was the deal they gave to Gehlen. Anyway, so that's, again, kind of tells you that like everything that we're experiencing and living through today is situated in the milieu of the British imperial structure.
Well, can you speak to, because recently Keir Starmer has talked about sending British troops to the front lines in Ukraine, and then it came out that they only actually have like 18,000 like military ready soldiers in Britain, which is, I mean, I wouldn't have suspected it was that low. That was kind of mind blowing for me. So, is the extension of force of whatever remains of the British Empire, is it now basically intelligence agencies? Because it doesn't seem like they have any significant actual military power. Is it blackmail? Is it, spies, intelligence? How would you describe the transition of like the fall of the British Empire into the spy networks?
Yeah, it's interesting because at one time, if you go back to the 1800s when the British East India Company was at its peak, I mean, it was bringing in like some outrageous amount of money that's like beyond even what Apple's worth. Like they were bringing this in on a regular basis. I mean, the East India Company was just insanely massive in terms of wealth and power, and it really was kind of the engine of the British Empire. And so, as it waned, I think the crown just one day kind of just appropriated it and said, "Okay, the British East India Company is the property of the crown now." So the British crown itself is interesting because it's kind of this entity or corporation that owns a lot of land in a lot of places you wouldn't expect. They're very large land holders. They own a lot of land in Canada. I don't even know if we know exactly how all that works. It is intertwined with the wealth and power of the Rothschilds as well. That's been a open, well-known thing for a long time. Obviously they were very influential and involved in the Bank of England, as well as the Bank of France. It quickly has many chapters on that. So, exactly the nature and extent of that is difficult to determine, but the empire itself waned as America rose to power. And so it went from, Pax Britannia to Pax Americana, especially after World War I and World War II. So the US came to power, but what the British were very adept at doing was through their sort of concentric circles model of how to construct what they call roundtable groups. You can have governments within governments is really how it works. And it's based on the East India Company's model of like the committees of shareholders within the company, who had just untold, vast amounts of wealth and control. So that's kind of the structure that they modeled their empire on. And Quigley talks about it like it was, loosely speaking, a secret society. He calls it the Society of the Elect. This was Cecil Rhodes's idea to create this Society of the Elect that would promote what he called a world federalist socialist union, to create an entire commonwealth of socialist type countries that would be the new British Empire. This was the original Cecil Rhodes, Rothschild, John Ruskin idea. So it didn't exactly play out like that. But one thing they were able to do was to bring America and American isolationism back under the sway of imperial global geopolitical strategies. And as you know, the founding fathers said, we want to stay out of European entanglements.
Right.
And so it took a lot of this wealth and power and influence in the US through things like the CFR, trilaterals, all that stuff. That's all set up on the model of Chatham House in the UK, which is this sort of Fabian socialist inner clique. British intelligence was set up as a Fabian socialist institution. Its heads were originally all Fabian socialists. And so you mentioned Keir Starmer. He is also openly a Fabian socialist. So exactly the same people, same strategy, same game plan. Tony Blair was a member of the Fabian Socialist Party. That kind of dominates the ideology, but you're right that it doesn't require vast armies, marching armies. British Empire was a naval power.
Right.
They were not a land power, as Dugan and many, geopolitical people talk about. You have a sea power versus land. Russia is a land power. British Empire, Britain's tiny, and yet it had this vast empire through controlling the seas. So it was a sea power, a money power, a banking power, ultimately. And a lot of people liken it to Italy, when Italy had a lot of power, right, centuries ago. They were also kind of a sea power.
Well, it seems like that banking power is the only thing that's left in regard to like British influence, British power, and its ability to exert it on the world. It seems like
I think they do project that power to a degree through the royal family, because the royal family, as we said, is kind of a corporation,
right,
that promotes to the West through Canada, through Australia, because those are still commonwealths of the British Empire.
Well, you speak of Commonwealth. What are your thoughts about King Charles supposedly coming to the U.S. to offer Trump the title of making the U.S. a Commonwealth? I mean, what are you familiar with what I'm talking about? Like,
I don't know what to make of that. I think it's goofy. It's silly. I mean, honestly, like all of the Trump saying we're going to make Canada a state, we're going to make Greenland. I have no idea what. I don't even understand what. I mean, I know it has to do with like trade deficits and whatever, but I have no idea what this means or where it's going. But but yeah, I mean, I think key point here, when we understand this, and to get back to your question about like pinpointing when it became a policy for the UK, way ahead of the EU, like the UK in 1910, 1920, very prominent Fabian socialists were at that time saying it's time to make alliances with Islam because we can change the face of the UK and Europe through Islam.
Right.
And so it became, a tool early on. First of all, not through the Wahhabi Salafi stuff, because if you tried to import that into the UK in the 1910s and 20s, it would have never worked. So what do? You do what's the Fabian model? A slow kill model.
Right.
Sunnis. We bring in the ecumenist, very perennialist minded Sunnis, the mystical Neoplatonic model.
Save them from persecution in the Middle East. Bring them to.
They even brought these guys over. Ratio has some really great chapters in his book where they bring these intellectuals and they let them teach at Oxford and Cambridge. These intellectual Sufis then set up these missionary publishing societies. They start promoting Sufism throughout the UK in the 1910s, 20s, 30s. Then over time, you start bringing in the more radical Sunni Wahhabi type elements. That's where we are today, where you have Londonistan. But it's not accidental. People think that it's just liberals that are open borders. No, it's a specific strategy that many of the Fabian socialist elites said, we got to eradicate Christianity in the West and in Europe. And one of the best ways to do that would be to flood the UK and EU with Islam.
Right.
They're very candid about it.
So other than the ability to alter and augment European identity and culture, and then the radical violent elements of Islam, why are intelligence agencies so interested in manipulating and utilizing Islam? Are there other aspects of the paradigm, the worldview, that are very useful as a utility for people who are wanting to control and manipulate populations?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we could think immediately of, what Miles Copeland says is that he says Islam is a great religion for creating a terror patsy. I mean, you've got the ready-made idea going back to, the martyrdom idea that, oh, guess what? Die for this cause and you're going to get laid for eternity, right?
Right.
So that's a very powerful motivation for perhaps not just young men who are very manipulable, but even unstable people can very easily be used in this way. And again, that's what Miles Copeland actually explains in his biography about this. He says that, they make the perfect patsy when we want this kind of an event. So it doesn't mean that the CIA or British intelligence is behind every TERR event. It's not saying that at all. It's just saying that when it's useful, it's very useful for, as you pointed out, everything from a destabilizing force in a rival nation to just terrorizing a target population. It can also bring about the end legal changes that you want. So you want to have, I don't know, body scanners at every airport.
Right.
Well, a giant T event would be great for that.
Right.
So there's a lot of different.
Right. And you had the subway bombing in London. I forget, was that the early 2000s? That was kind of like their 9/11 event that reorganized their society.
7/7, exactly. Great example. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was also mentioning, when you were talking about that, I was thinking that Islam is also so culturally cohesive that is another reason why it is such a useful weapon against Western nations is, the unity of Arabic. You can find, Buddhist traditions and they don't all speak the same language. They don't all come from the same culture, but Islam is sort of a submission to Arabism.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's filled with political and militaristic ideology in the
Yes.
name of religion. So it seems like it, as a paradigm, out of all the world religions, Islam is certainly the most useful if you want to sort of take control of
It's a death cult. It's a model for creating a kind of a death cult type of thing. Absolutely. Absolutely. Great. That's a great point. I mean, even even a lot of the modern apologists critiquing Islam, whether it's David Wood or Sam Shamoon or Jay Smith, a lot of people who have critiqued it have noted that you can see early on in the Quran that before the later, battles that Muhammad engaged in, it's intended to be the revelation for Arab peoples. So in other words, at early points in the Quran, Allah speaks as if, well, the Jews have their Bible and the Christians have their thing. This is the thing for the Arabs, right?
Mm.
So it initially has this very ethno-nationalist, I guess you could say, vibe to it, before later on Muhammad says after certain battles, oh no, actually this is to take over the whole world now. So you can actually see an internal contradiction in the Quran itself, to where it moves from being just relative to the Arab peoples to, oh no, actually this is for everybody. Conquer everybody now.
Right. Now, how much influence, because you're talking about the earlier years of the British intelligence having to do with, the OPEC nations, oil, energy, how much influence do they still have in places like Qatar and the UAE and Saudi Arabia? I mean, what in your perspective, what is that influence and relationship with British intelligence still?
I think that British intelligence has since the Cold War or earlier had what they call a special relationship with America. So they link up and they do things very closely. It's part of the, Five Eyes, Seven Eyes. These are the,
Right.
Western sort of intelligence powers and structures that are united together. So I think the key thing to realize here is that, remember that for us in the West, there might be periods where we have some sort of disagreement with the UK or whatever, but the overlord oligarchic power structure is the same. It's the same upper level people that run both the US and the UK, and by extension the EU, because if you understand, the European Union itself was set up by the OSS and the CIA. It's literally a creation of the OSS and CIA. This is the post Tiny Mustache Man. After he loses, OSS and CIA comes in and literally sets up all that. In fact, they even brainwash the Germans with re-education camps. So we think of that as a Soviet communist thing. No, actually the CIA set up, I'm serious, they set up re-education camps for Germans after World War II. So, you've got this elite corporate banking structure, I believe, that is what Quigley calls the, Atlanticist East Anglo-American establishment. And that includes the nation state of Israel, so I'm not excluding them.
Mm-hmm.
And they still see, certain places like Russia, maybe Iran to some degree. I'm iffy on how, how much I think Iran is a real threat or not. But I think they do see these, the way that Brzezinski said, we have to make sure that there could never be any potential threat or challenge to Atlanticist dominance, and thus control of Eurasia, according to Brzezinski, was the key means to that. Hence why for them Ukraine is so important, because that's essential to Western NATO dominance in the Eurasian heartland. So so that's why a lot of these things happen, is these motivations. But I don't think, like you said, it's not really British. I mean, British intelligence plays a key role because, for example, British intelligence created the P-gate scandal. That was literally created by the Steele dossier.
Yeah, the Steele dossier,
That's
exactly.
straight out of British intelligence created.
Well, and it seems like that's what the CIA does, is whenever they want to do any sort of domestic operation, they just give all the tools over to the UK, and then MI5 or MI6 then comes up with something, and all of a sudden it's national, global news that something XYZ has happened.
Exactly. Absolutely.
So there is.
That's why you see like Savile and those creeps, tied into the same intelligence structure in the UK, and MI5, MI6 have these brothels that they run, like Elm Guest House.
And Epstein, I mean,
Yep.
Maxwell, the father, senior, I mean, it was Mossad and British intelligence who he worked for the most, correct?
Likewise with apparently Lord Victor Rothschild appears to be doing a very similar type of thing, correct? Except in Victor's case, it wasn't just Western. He was actually also working with Soviets. So you'll find certain players actually play both sides of the Cold War.
And so can you speak to this dialectic that the globalist Anglo-American banking dominant structure, how it sort of demonizes domestic population, spies all them, blackmails anybody with influence, and at the same time then brings in massive amounts of people to totally alter and transform the cultures? I mean, I already have an idea, but how does these things relate to the endpoint of a new global order? What are they trying to construct through all this?
Well, a couple examples is, and this is a controversial topic, but I mean, I have his actual books. You can read Count Coudenhove-Kalergi's book, Practical Idealism, which I have right over there. And he says, we can destroy Europe through changing the demographics. Quigley says that the Royal Society elites, the people in RIIA, the Royal Institute for International Affairs and others, they basically said, let's go with the Count's plan. And that's identical to what the Fabian socialists were pushing, what they wanted. They realized that in order to have a future socialist technocracy type of world federation, you would need to destroy the firewalls that stood in the way of that. And firewalls would be nation states and religious ideologies like Christianity, as well as even things that we think of as fundamental, like the family unit. Fabian socialists believe that eventually you'd have to get rid of the family because families are directly connected to private property and inheritance,
right?
And heritage and tradition. And if you're going to have a brave new world, you got to get rid of that stuff.
Right. So the posthumanists, I mean, there's a whole strand about decoupling reproduction from sexual practices. So I mean, their goal, and these are papers from very important institutions literally saying that the future of reproduction will be totally, I mean, in my terms, a sort of synthetic fabrication. It's going to be done in a laboratory. It's going to be done through IVF. And these are academic articles that I was citing in my paper. They're literally saying that, sex, not just gender, not just performative gender, but actual sex will be on a fluid spectrum, that all the tranny stuff. This is all intentional, and actual intercourse is only going to be for pleasure. So they want to make it that actually people probably can't reproduce even if they wanted to. And so everybody is just then hedonistic, pursuing sexual gratification, and nobody can actually reproduce.
Yeah, I remember that Lord Birkenhead's famous essay. He's one of these British technocratic Fabian socialist elites. He wrote back in 1920s the essay for Cosmopolitan magazine, where he said, save my article because in 100 years, babies will come out of test tubes. You'll have a world government, et cetera, et cetera. And props to Tristan for he hit me to that before. I'd never even heard of Lord Birkenhead. I've been reading all these books, and he found that essay years ago. But it's also identical to what Huxley wrote in Brave New World. Like in chapter 1 or 2 of Brave New World, it's actually explained that the babies are born in test tubes because that's the only way to have the technocratic state be your stand-in mommy or daddy. Because if you're born to a parent, you have an immediate attachment to them. If you're born in a test tube, you got mad scientist Dr. Man as your daddy.
Right.
Literally.
Seriously.
They say that in the character in, I think it's chapter 1 actually explains that this is why we birth the babies in the test tubes and not from a mother anymore.
Right. And that abstraction of parenthood is going to make somebody much more sympathetic to like central authority. So like a communist or a socialist or some centralized governmental identity. If your identity is not coming from your parents and from like genetic heritage and culture, it's going to be, you're going to tie yourself to whatever structure of importance exists in that particular context. So,
Absolutely.
so if like for these Fabian socialists, it makes total sense. Makes
And
total sense.
also, there's also a connection too, believe it or not, between that and espionage, because one of the things they learned in the, say, past 100 years of recruiting people for British intelligence work was that a lot of times people who made the best spies were the ones that didn't have parental figures. And so in the case of James Bond, he's a case example because Bond is the figure who is an orphan.
Right.
And the handlers, M in the novels, they know that. And so Queen and Country becomes the Queen becomes this sort of stand-in, aloof mother figure, nanny state figure. And that's not just him. I mean, in the Mounier book, I mean, there's other spies who were also famously orphans. So you can learn from those test cases of those people to then they could extrapolate and say, well, why don't we just make everybody this kind of, automaton who,
Right.
and I'm not saying that like James Bond's supposed to be just a killing machine, right? But the point is that he doesn't have a conscience and he doesn't have the firewalls that we're talking about because of the early trauma. And so if you can traumatize, say, youthful people when on a mass scale when they're young, which is what we're seeing with a lot of this TRA and Z stuff.
Right.
And, the stuff that they're doing to, what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Reassignment stuff and all like that is just going to damage them for life.
Right.
And that kind of information is exactly what spies and people who were engaged in sexual compromise were themselves learning and doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and it draws you mentioned that Islam is a death cult, and it draws that sort of strand and ties both this Anglo-American global establishment banking elite, because they themselves are a death cult and the things that they're pushing. And so Islam, they have no ideological difference. This is something that I was seeing in one of the chats, I forget, a few streams ago, but talking about how some of these British elites, they just don't realize yet what all these Muslims are going to do to their country. And it's like, dude, what are you talking about? They don't have an opposition to it. They don't care. They know exactly what's going to happen. And so what are your kind of thoughts on, I mean, like in that video I did on the city of London, London is the most Muslim city in all of Europe. I believe it's the first city to have over 1,000 mosques.
Yeah, I mean, I just posted a couple weeks ago the classic clips of Prince Philip saying, the number one problem in the world is people.
Right.
And he says people are a plague. And I found the old Guardian article where it says that one of his most famous quotes is, "I hope when I die to come back as a virus to get rid of most." So you understand that the British elites, they don't care about Britain. They don't care about the British people. In fact, they hate them. They're Malthusians.
Right.
They're like open, rabid Malthusians. And when you understand that, and when you understand the Fabian socialist technocratic ideology, everything they're doing makes perfect sense. It's not idiot liberals who don't know what's happening. No, they know what's happening.
Exactly.
It's you that doesn't know what's happening because you listen to Matt Walsh and all these people who act like there's no plan.
Scapegoating of ignorance amongst the elite. I think that's one of the. It's actually a very nefarious.
It is
out for a lot of people. Is like, oh well, they're just ignorant. No, dude, they're not ignorant at all. Don't you realize this is all
because they think that it's like Joe Biden running stuff.
Yeah.
Look at that idiot up there. He can't even talk.
Yeah.
Of course he wasn't running shit. He's the perfect face for all this stuff.
So is there, I'm sure there is a role amongst the intelligence agencies, like the fact that they've been able to get all of Western Europe and at least a handful of Central European nations to buy into all this stuff and allow all this mass immigration. I mean, I have a friend in Greece, and Athens is being absolutely overrun with Muslims. It sounds like the PM in Italy is trying to take some type of stand, but France seems to be gone. My wife is from Germany, and so she's from southern Germany and Stuttgart, and they have so many Turks that are coming that now 2 out of every 3 babies born in Stuttgart are Turkish. And that only, you play that for just a generation or two and it's game over. This isn't going to take long. So what are your thoughts on, I mean, how they've been able to get, is it just through the centralization of the EU and the sort of socialist structure that Europe has? But it's amazing how outside of maybe Poland and Hungary, there's not really many voices in opposition to literally the replacement of their population and mass immigration.
Well, post World War II, what the West did was, through the OSS and CIA, not just set up like sort of brainwashing, re-education stuff for Germans. They also set up the socialist EU model on purpose as one of these kind of Fabian institutions, as a kind of a test run, or to try to get, the proto Fabian socialist world government going. So when you look at the EU, that's what you're looking at is a version of them setting what we're talking about up. And that includes a lot of media control, a lot of control of education. Again, like we mentioned in the case of Germany, it was the CIA that set up the B&D out of the Galen organization's network. And there might be some ignorant persons who think, well, wouldn't that be tried and based? No, it's not tried and based. It's immediately turned into what Western ideology wants to push. And so you get decades then of these entities controlling the education system in Europe, controlling the banking in Europe, such that you could even have that famous banker Peter Sutherland about 10 years ago. I think he's dead now, but he came out and said, it's mainstream news. He said, yes, as a massive EU banking elite person, my job is to destroy the nation states of the European Union and turn them into one big blob that we can control in a socialist way. Right. So there it is right there. Just go read Peter Sutherland's statement on what the purpose of the EU is. And other people have kind of leaked this stuff out too. Even General Wesley Clark, who some people were big fans of because he was against the Bush stuff and, right, the Seven Nations plan and all that. But General Wesley Clark famously said that the goal for NATO was to help destroy European nation states and turn them into a big socialist blob. That's the goal. So they were sold under the guise of, oh, this will help us be a more powerful economic union. That was kind of the selling line that they were giving the people for the EU through the OSS and what was called the European Project, the European Steel and Coal Development Project. Those were all corporate banking and OSS created things that helped to try to transition Europe into this union. But it was also, according to David Rockefeller in his memoirs, planned at Bilderberg. So Bilderberg also played a big role in creating and planning the EU back in the 40s and 50s. It's not a 1990s-ish thing. It's actually planned that long ago, because they're thinking, long term about creating these continental unions. World Federal Socialist Unions is what they are. And then it doesn't matter whether you have the title of, you could call yourself the Free State of Liberia, like you're integrated into, right, a big socialist union. Right. It doesn't matter what you call yourself. So they don't have to be called, the nation, the Fabian Socialist, Committee of Liberia. Like you can call yourself whatever you want. Right. It's integrated into continental unions is the plan. And so I think some people have expressed concern in regard to Trump's statements about Canada and Mexico.
That is Region 3 in Agenda 21. That was my initial response once I heard about, okay, Greenland, maybe they're going to vote and want to join the U.S. And then it was like the next day after a conversation with Trudeau, is like making them the 51st state. And I pulled up the map, Agenda 21, and that's literally Region 3.
Yeah, it's possible. I don't know the long-term game plan. I doubt that the Trump administration and the people in the Trump administration have looked at the stuff we're talking about today this in depth. Because I'm not trying to be arrogant or whatever, but like a lot of this, like the stuff we're talking about, like that's Brzezinski, Kissinger level stuff. This is what they write about, and very few people read or talk about the Brzezinski, Kissinger type of geopolitical stuff.
That's mind blowing for these people to be
Isn't that
in
crazy?
positions of power that they don't read that stuff.
I mean, maybe there's somebody, and I don't know. I mean, I'm sure, you know, I mean, Alex knows this type of material. You know, he talks to Roger Stone and Trump and all them, and I mean, I would imagine Roger Stone knows. I mean, I just don't know. Like, I'm not, you know, I don't
Right.
talk to the White House. I don't know what, but I don't hear many people talking about, you know, Kissinger, Brzezinski level stuff, and
Right.
that's what we're talking about today. So I don't know.
No, and I've found even amongst people in some of the more red, what the kids call red pill or based and conspiratorial mindset, is as soon as you bring up this dialectic between Hamas and Israel, there's literally articles from the Times of Israel talking about Mossad and Israel funding Hamas, doing exactly what we're talking about, this general false dialectic with these intelligence agencies. And you bring this up to people, you think are pretty reasonable and know what's going on. And this is like too much for them to fathom that, why would Israel fund Hamas? Well, if you want to,
Well, you can actually
Palestine.
read Victor Ostrovsky, the very guy who was in the Mossad at the time, and who, you know, I'm pretty sure he talks about knowing Arafat personally. Israel didn't want the PLO and the stabilizing secular force. They wanted the radical position of Hamas because it's a destabilizing force. They weren't successful, according to Ostrovsky, in getting Arafat on anything personal. He lived a very kind of austere, basically moral life. So they didn't have him go into, you know, prostitutes or stealing money. And so they found that mode, and this is by way of deception in 1990, he doesn't explicitly mention Hamas. He just hints that they were wanting to arm and fund rivals to them. And then later on in the 1994 book, which I just got, apparently he does explicitly mention Hamas. So yeah, in the 70s or whatever, they saw that as and it's the same as what the guy just said about Syria. He's like, yeah, we would fund an arm al-Nusra because we would rather have that destabilizing force versus Assad, who's a stabilizing force. So, and he even says, the guy in that Al Jazeera interview says that's the rules of the game. So what do you mean? So this is what everybody does. So that's the way he plays it in the interview. But yeah, if you think about it, this actually makes sense. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I just went a lot deeper into a lot of stuff I didn't know about that region and Lebanon and you know, the Shia role in Lebanon, and it's all really fascinating. There's a really good movie from 2018 with John Hamm and Rosamund Pike called Beirut, and I recommend people watch that because it's a little Hollywood, but what's good about the movie is that it presents everybody as having their angle and their desires in this very tense region of, you have Lebanon here and then you have Israel here. So North Israel and Lebanon border, right?
Right.
And you have Christians in Lebanon, you have Shia in Lebanon, and you have Sunni factions in Lebanon. So it's a factionalized country that's also got a lot of organized crime groups in Lebanon. And so they're not a real threat to Israel. And even I think in the 80s, the Phalangists who were largely the Maronite Catholic militia, they were actually funded and aided by the CIA and Mossad. So it gets very complicated because the Christians in Lebanon had this alliance with CIA and Mossad. The Shia in Lebanon, are there to supposedly put pressure on Israel and be supposedly a militia or terrorist organization, depending upon how you view them. So it's just a really wild, complex region.
Yeah.
And the Shia don't like the Sunni, and the Shia didn't like the PLO. So it's
right.
It's a big,
well, and then with everything that's happened with the undermining of the Assad regime and the fall of Syria, one of the things that I've been covering some books on, like eschatological prophecies from various saints and Saint Paisios and various other elders of the church. And one of the things that they talked about as we get closer towards the end times is that Turkey is going to be an enemy of Russia, and it's going to be fully aligned with the West. And, a couple years ago, I mean, it seemed like Russia and Turkey had a pretty good relationship. But what recently just unfolded in Syria is essentially Turkey backstabbed Russia, made an agreement with the West and with Israel to basically take the northern portion of Syria. And I find that very interesting, is now we can kind of see how these power factions are splitting up. And at least according to some, and we take, eschatology is a difficult subject to discuss, but at least the patterns are emerging, and it's beginning to make a lot more sense on how Erdogan and Turkey and all this posturing that he's going to save the Palestinians from Israel, and yet he's actually making a backdoor deal with Israel. Yeah, let's go ahead and fund these radical Muslims to take over Syria, and then we'll just cut it up. And then the U.S. takes a northern piece where the Kurds are. To your point, it's like, well, they have their own faction with the military of the Kurds to maintain control there.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's that one gets really complex, and I don't even understand all the ins and outs of the Turkish role and all that. But they because of where they're located, a lot of the aid or arms has to go through Turkey, right? So for some of these places. So I say that because going back to 2014, 2017, we were at that time I was writing a lot of articles for 21st Century Wire with Patrick Henningsen, and we were covering I'm trying to pull up a map here so we can see the I need a bigger map, but we were covering this issue because we knew that it was obvious that the CIA and obviously the Israelis, as well as British intelligence, like they were aiding and funding the al-Nusra in Syria to try to get rid of Assad, and they were calling them the moderate rebels, right? Well, the CFR had put up an article prior to all of this. Yeah, there we go. So yeah. So like if weapons, for example, are going to come from Iran to Lebanon, right, it needs to go either through Turkey or through Syria to reach Lebanon if they were going to arm if they were going to arm the Shia, or if there was going to be arming of ISIS in Syria. Turkey back in the 2014, 2017 time period was also helping ISIS in Syria, or al-Nusra in Syria. So this was being discussed by many outlets. And I remember vividly because I was writing articles about it and I was getting called all kinds of names. If you talked about the CIA or the West or Israel arming and helping al-Nusra in Syria, even though John McCain is like meeting with, he's in pictures with the freaking Al-Qaeda dudes, like you were called crazy, you were called insane, it doesn't exist. Well, a few months ago, the New York Times just published their gigantic front page article on Timber Sycamore. So we actually know the name of the 2014 to 2017 $1 billion plan. It was called Timber Sycamore, where they armed, trained, and funded al-Nusra in Syria. Right. So there you go. Like we were called. I mean, I can't tell you how many people were like calling me names back then. And it's like I've been sharing this. Like just look up the New York Times Timber Sycamore. It'll come up right away. It's the first.
Well, and people were even denying reports after the withdrawal from Afghanistan that the U.S. was sending millions of dollars to the Taliban. Well, now that's a fact. We know that, according to Trump taking office, that it stopped. But it was like upwards between $40 to $70 million a week the U.S. was sending to the Taliban, who, according to them, we had to fight this 20-some year war in Afghanistan to stop. What? Like, it makes no sense. But even once that became public knowledge, people were still reluctant to even recognize that.
Well, so that should have been obvious, because that goes back to 1979, where Brzezinski came up with the plan. It's called Operation Cyclone. This is under Carter, to arm the Mujahideen, freedom fighters, in the Soviet Afghanistan conflict. And the plan was actually a pretty smart plan because it worked. So Operation Cyclone literally was successful in exhausting the Soviet force there. And this helped the later collapse of the Soviet Empire under a few years later in the 80s. But had not this been successful, that probably wouldn't have happened. But this is where the CIA makes its alliance with the Mujahideen, who are these freedom fighter Al-Qaeda people. They become the the drawing pool from which we get Al Qaeda.
Right. And British intelligence was involved with this as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So it's the same playbook over and over and over, and it's just irritating that people, because they're so embedded into their emotions and they act irrationally whenever you bring up, especially Israel here in the United States, that people that are often, although that Overton window seems to be shifting quite a bit in the last 2 years, but generally speaking, to see these dialectical tensions of how radical Islam is a utility of Western intelligence agencies to create chaos, destabilization, so that they can expand power and control. I mean, it's just clear as day now. I don't even know how anybody can deny it. And this is why, and I'm curious what your opinions are on the normalization of Islam in the West as well. We see, and I'm not here to accuse anybody of anything, but the Tate brothers, at least according to online, there was a massive spike in young men looking into Islam during before the Romania allegations, and that case was dropped. So I'm not here to accuse anybody of anything, but Andrew Tate converted to Islam, and it was like one of the biggest search things in like Western, for young men in the West, was searching up Islam and looking to convert to Islam. And it does give them a kind of a coherent, I mean, it's not totally coherent. Islam is filled with contradictions, but at least their perception, a worldview and an identity where they could get married and have a virgin, and for some of them appeal to having multiple wives. But what are your thoughts on this sort of normalization of Islam, and sometimes to the detriment? So people have so much animosity towards Israel, or who they think are controlling the levers of power in the West, that they like welcome Islam. And we, as especially Orthodox Christians, in the history of the Orthodox Church, this is a false diet. You don't choose one or the other. What are your thoughts on this?
No, I think it's really important for people to understand, and this is tied into a lot of the right-wing reaction. They will see, certain countries from the Middle East having a lot of influence in America.
Yeah.
And then they will assume that the alliance with anything Islamic would be a natural right-wing alliance. I think this is really foolish.
Yeah.
Because you have to understand that there's a lot of other players and people with a lot of money. The Saudi royal family is a big pusher for Islam in the West. Other Gulf states do push and promote Islam in the West. And that shouldn't be surprising. I think we should, if you just think about how nation states in general, how they project power, it's if you're the king of Jordan and you're a Hashemite and you believe your Islamic stuff, you're going to want people interested in Islam. You're going to desire the promotion, just like we would desire Orthodox Christianity everywhere, right?
Right.
They're going to think the same way. They're going to want and support and fund Islamic endeavors in the West. So we needn't think of it as if it's all, CIA, MI6, Mossad pushing Islam. It doesn't work like that. Those groups will, for example, make alliances with whoever they need in any of these regions to push whatever will work for them. So it's not ideological, it's just pragmatic is the key point here. So like when the CIA is funding and arming the Mujahideen, it's not because they believe in Al-Qaeda ideology. It's because that's what's useful in that region to fight the Soviets. So likewise, there are Islamic nations, Islamic movements, Islamic banking structures that push and fund Islam in the West. And it's not all the CIA. It's like, we drove to Vegas some months back, and I noticed across America, and I've been driving back and forth across America for the last 7 years, more than I ever have. Mosques. I saw a mosque on an Indian reservation.
Wow. Would have thought about that.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. There is a push for Islam in the West, and that's not all, CIA or Israel. I mean, there's actual, Gulf states and Saudis, and
it seems like that push is the way that it's often presented as an antidote to like Western degeneracy. So as the national cultures of the West are inundated with all this debauchery and sexual sin, it's like, well, now you need a militaristic, masculine religion to come in here and clean things up. And then it's like, here's Islam. And so they present this as the alternative to, so if you hate the left, well, then why don't you become a Muslim? Because then you'll be able to fight it. And even when I look at, and I've never been to England, I've been to Ireland, but never been to England. But just based on articles that I've seen, it's like they let the Muslim population get away with criticism of the leftist agenda, the sort of leftist narrative within England, that they don't let the average British person say. So if you're an average British person, you criticize it, you're a problem. But when entire Muslim communities do it, oh, no problem at all. Which facilitates that movement towards it.
Yeah, absolutely, by design. We went there in 2019, and I mean, you just like, it's Islamic everywhere. I mean, we were in London for a week, and then we were out in the country at in Milton Keynes, where I gave a lecture for another week. So, I got a week's worth of London, and it's just sad to see what used to at one time be, a Christian area be so heavily Islamic. But it's interesting because you go back to the Middle Ages, whether you're in the Roman Catholic West or if you're in, Byzantium, you go back to the Middle Ages, pretty much every Christian understood that Islam is like chastisement. You know what I mean? It's like the divine chastisement when if you turn degenerate, this is your chastisement.
Right.
So it's not that Islam's true. It's that, well, it's like what scripture says, like, if you follow what God says, you'll be strong. If you're degenerate, you'll be ruled over, just like he told Israel.
And in that light, even the military conquest of the Ottoman empires, Erdogan, I showed a quote that he had. He was talking about the amount of Muslims that now exist in Western Europe, and he was talking about the growth and the building of all these mosques. And he said, yeah, this is one of the greatest accomplishments in Islamic history, that out of all the military conquests, we could have never imagined the influence we now exert within Western Europe. And that was right out of the mouth of Erdogan. It's like, so the power players in the Muslim world absolutely see this in a militaristic framing. They, this is not, some of our, compatriots are now live in Germany and England and France. No, they look at it as, this is wonderful. Look at all these young men we have there. We're going to take it over.
Well, I mean, the mayor, Sadiq Khan, is mayor of London. I think he's also a Fabian socialist too. So yeah, the Fabian Socialist alliance with Islam, again, is over 100 years old. And that's explicitly to totally change the West.
Are you familiar? Is Islam pretty sympathetic with socialist ideas? I mean,
so in the Quran itself, I think the idea of taqiyya is over exaggerated. It's not that Muslims are like literally told in all these cases to lie, but there's a statement in the Quran where it says, when you are in the minority, you pretend to be the friend and the, flexible one.
Right.
Then when you're the majority, you can become militaristic.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yes. So Shamoon points to that I forget the exact reference, but it is there. It's kind of early on in the Quran. I forget the exact reference, but yeah, it says that.
So regarding everything that's going on, is there any event or region in particular that you kind of have your eyes out looking at? What are kind of your thoughts? Obviously it's speculation, but moving forward, your thoughts on Europe with all this mass immigration, and the negotiations with Israel and Hamas and some of I think Qatar is leading the negotiation. They're supposed to be like the middleman and creating some type of settlement. What are your thoughts on all this?
A lot of those Gulf states are also longtime, Western CIA allies. Like
absolutely
Time magazine even years ago reported on King Hussein of Jordan. Like he was just bought off by the sea. Like all they have to do is like basically just fly in and like bring a chest of gold or a bag of money, and they just give it to these guys. So they're kind of easy to buy off. But it's the same with Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan, right? That was famously reported on many times, that the CIA would just bring him duffel bags of money. I mean, you know, I just see myself as a student of this stuff. I don't even really know where it's going or how to project the you know, what's going to happen. I mean, I think that, you know, in the future we will be contending with more and more Islam, which is just, I mean, when you get into it, it's just so silly. Like it's kind of amazing, really, that people fall for it. And I understand, like you're saying, like the young dudes that are just searching stuff online, they don't know anything. It's like, well, yeah, dude, like what about one God versus like the Trinity is like three gods?
Exactly.
Like, I understand if you're at that level, you might think, oh, well, this is like based in like trad or whatever.
Right. They always present it as more believable than the Christian worldview.
And it's like people, they don't even realize that, you know, like even Sneeko more recently has been, like, did you see that clip going around where he was getting
about the Hadith? He didn't know that he has to agree with everything in the Hadith.
Dude, it's not just the Quran and like this basic boil down of like simple, you got to believe all the Hadiths, dude.
Right.
And the Hadiths have the crazy stuff in it. You know what I mean?
Serious craziness.
Like Satan farting and stuff.
Right.
Literally. So it's just, it's like a cult where the people are not told, like Mormonism, like they're not told like the inner, you know, space sci-fi crap until you've been in it for a while.
But, and Sneeko's a perfect example of somebody who uses their Islam as like, you know, right-wing talking points in defense of all this degeneracy here in the West. And look how ineffective and weak Christianity is. You know, you guys might as well just give it up. I mean, I've seen clips of him basically saying that, in other words, but, you know, you guys are screwed because look how ineffective Christianity is.
And we can, you know, it's hard to argue with the massive amount of the Roman Catholic and Protestant world that is so weak and skittles.
Yeah.
You can see why they think that. But, you know, a lot of those things are going away. You know, for example, in France, I'm pretty sure that like a bunch of Roman Catholic cathedrals and monasteries have been bought by Orthodox in the last 10, 20 years.
Oh, really?
So, yeah.
That's great.
So like as the Roman Catholics are dying out and, you know, selling off their churches to pay all their PDF bills for their, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
As they're paying their, you know, sex scandal bills and lawsuits, they're having to sell cathedrals and shut down entire like churches and dioceses. Like they've been doing in America too. They have to sell it off. So Orthodoxy is growing. You know, those things are dying out. And that's, you know, when you adopt those kind of like sterile ideologies, like a lot of these woke Protestant churches have, I mean, you're basically sealing your doom and ending your denomination in the next few decades.
Right.
So those won't exist anymore. There won't be Methodist, Lutheran, mainline Protestant churches anymore. They're going to Presbyterian. They're going to die out. And so it will be, you know, if trad cat stuff still exists, maybe that, maybe some versions of Calvinism and Orthodoxy is all there is.
Right. What are your thoughts on the way that Russia has handled their Muslim population? Because it seems like they've, at least maybe, again, I'm no expert on this. I'm curious what your thoughts are, but it seems like they've made an explicit recognition that Russia is Orthodox, at least to some degree, but then the Muslim communities, the Chechens, you know, all those different, they can maintain their Islamic identity under a sort of larger Russian banner. And sort of
there's some kind of recognition of this idea of some kind of, quote, you know, traditionalism that's broad enough to encapsulate Islam, because I think there's like 1 million Muslims in Moscow.
Right.
So, you know, it's unfortunate. I don't like that at all, but you know, I guess it's just it's a situation where maybe pragmatically they're forced to do it. But
I read one article that Putin spoke explicitly about Slavic peoples need to have 3 to 4 children per, because they're being, you know, they're being outpopulated by the smaller Muslim communities in southern Russia.
Yeah, I have heard that too. And, so we see a lot of good statements. Hey, Jamie, could you make me an espresso? Thank you. Maybe as the world continues to wake up to orthodoxy, again, one of the great things, as people have been pointing out, like the internet's been pretty bad for Islam. I'm
Yeah,
curious, like,
it's been great for orthodoxy.
yeah, like, and it might be the case that, early on, a lot of idiot 20-year-old dudes maybe search it out, but like, we just had that debate with Shamoon on Fresh and Fit a few months ago, that 3 to 4 million people, and
Right.
you read the comments, and it's like 50,000 comments, 99% saying that, Islam is not doing well on the internet.
Right.
So, they might have a lot of money to put into propaganda, but I don't think that it's kind of foreign to the West, and the only way it can concede in the West is when they import foreign peoples to the West.
Right.
So the more that we stop, the open border nonsense, perhaps that would help to stem the tide of the lunacy of this crazy cult.
Last question before we get into super chats. Kind of a bit of a diversion, but what are your thoughts on? We've talked about the intelligence agencies, the utilization of Islam, these false dialectics, and I'm curious what your thoughts are with the Trump administration. We were supposed to get some of the Epstein files. That was a fugazi operation there. They had some influencers come out with a binder of everything that was publicly available.
Well, yeah, I don't know.
They did release.
We may still get them. I may not. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, they did release the JFK files, but I'm curious, in your geopolitical analysis, what do you see happening with this Trump administration? In my perspective, it looks like it's sort of domestic policies that are going to maybe hurt in the short term with tariffs and all this stuff, but is going to be good long-term beneficially for like an economic engine. But it feels like this is totally tied at the hip with Zionism, and that Christian Zionism specifically is now like the official voice of Christianity in America, with Pastor Paula White heading the faith office in the White House. And we have Hegseth talking about how he wants to rebuild the third temple. And so within the Trump administration, we have all these Christian Zionists that are sort of accelerationist.
It's a weird mix because, the JFK files do contain many things that implicate certain Middle Eastern countries, which,
Right.
I've been talking about the whole last week, and I did not expect that to be there. So, why or what's going on, I don't know. But, you do have people who have talked about that, like Roger Stone, very close to Trump.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that I agree with everything that these people, argue or say. It's just these are the facts. And that was a very controversial thesis, put out by Michael Collins Piper 20 years ago in his book. I read it at the time, and you just couldn't even talk about that for a long time. So I'm surprised to see that there is, particularly in regard to all the stuff about James Jesus Angleton, who was a mega, Israeliophile. He was the CIA station chief in Rome for a long time, and then he became a Cold War spy master.
Sort of the mediator between Israeli intelligence and U.S. intelligence. So everything.
And again, people who knew that and talked about that for the last 20 years, you were his role with being pro-Israel was public, but this idea of a back channel was theory. And if you talked about that, you would be derided, to say the least. You know what I mean? Like, that's
do you have any hope that there is a, quote unquote, it's being repackaged as sort of a regime change in Washington? I feel pretty skeptical about it. Is it just yet to be seen? Do you feel like there's, is there a sort of regime change, or is the again, this deeper, higher Anglo-American establishment, is it still behind the wheel? Even, Trump can do all the stuff that he wants to do, or domestic policy stuff like that, economic stuff, but the ship's moving in the same direction.
There is some degree of opposition from, the administration, because, you know, all these people, what Doge is talking about and uncovering, like all this, you know, JFK files, like I feel like if we got the JFK files, I feel like we probably will get the Jeff Stein McCaffrey files. You know, maybe they won't be too redacted. I guess we'll see. But there's definitely a real awakening in the country. It's always hard to say in terms of the administration itself. I don't follow a lot of the day-to-day stuff because I'm usually trying to focus on the more, you know, meta political stuff and the geopolitics. But I think good things are happening. I try to be positive about those things. You know, one thing I keep saying is we've been under such intense mind control for so many decades and so much mainstream media brainwashing and just nonsense. It's not all going to be fixed in one administration. You know what I mean? Like we're going to be crawling out of this mess for decades. But we're seeing a lot more good things than I would have ever thought was going to happen, even as bad as some of this stuff is.
And in regarding that false dialectic, one of the things that I'm sure you'd agree with this, you've talked about it, but with this sort of valorization of Elon Musk, not that I'm not against Doge. I think it's fantastic. Finding all this corruption, USAID, all that stuff is fantastic. But I was speaking with an Orthodox Christian, and they were talking about how great Musk is and thinking, man, I wonder if he's going to become Christian. I'm like, dude, no. Like, you realize that creating a more efficient and robust America for his domestic production and creating, I mean, he is a transhumanist. He is a one world order figure. I mean, he spoke openly about this. And in one article, he'll say that we're summoning the demons through the AI. And then literally in the next paragraph, he'll say, well, the only way to stop it then is we have to fuse with it so that we can control the AI from within or something. So you look at all these corporations that he's been creating in the last like 2 or 3 years. It's all a technocracy. It's all for a global technocracy. And so I just find that really interesting that hear so many people that are happy that he's supporting Trump and he's MAGA and it's like, well, multiple things can be true. He can be cutting fraud and abuse and making the U.S. government more efficient. But the reasons why he's doing this is for a goal in 20 to 30 years for what he's going to have in place and the economic engine that's going to be behind it. And I found that a lot of people aren't seeing
that. I mean, he's definitely a wild card. I try to remain detached and, you know, just look at what's happening and hope for the best. I mean, I don't know exactly where he's just a wild card. I don't even know how to read him because it's like you see this, he'll do this and it seems like really based, then he'll do this other thing. It's like, well, why is he? It doesn't make it's just kind of like it's incoherent. I don't really understand what's going on. And but I do think that if if we want to keep it to the most positive possible like attitude that we could have, Jacques Attali in his book, he's mega globalist. Right. He says in his 2006 book, Brief History of the Future, he says, as globalists, we must be concerned that that America does not get into real Christianity. He actually says that. He says, because the major threat that we could experience to our hegemony would be a revival of some kind of what he calls, this is his words, theocracy in America. And he says that there could be a reaction against what we do and America turning to a theocracy, which we must guard against. So even the global elites are concerned and worried that the religious right might make power moves. And I'm not saying that, that doesn't really have anything to do directly with Musk, but if you're talking 20, 30, 40 years in the future, Elon Musk might not be around by then. You have a next generation. If Orthodox Christianity grows, you could have an Orthodox Christian American empire that's like technologically, you know what I mean? Like, right. I'm not trying to be overly optimistic and silly about it or to deny.
No, St. Paisios, multiple saints regarding eschatology believe that, at least in their framework, and this is from saints from specifically Russia, Romania, and Greece, mm-hmm. is that there'll be a great world war, mm-hmm. and then Orthodoxy is going to go through a golden age,
Right.
and that it's going to have massive explosion around the world, and that this is the prerequisite before an actual antichrist or anything like that. That there has to be
that would fulfill post-millennialism in my view, which I've always been post-mill, but I know that some people are all mill. I think in Orthodoxy you can be either one, but if that was the case, that would fulfill that.
Right. Well,
of the idea of a mass, Orthodox conversion of the world.
Right. Which would make a lot of sense. And one of the things, we've already seen these hit pieces from like the New York Post and stuff kind of characterize this massive growth in Orthodoxy here within the since 2020. So within now the last 5 years, as something nefarious, young men searching for identity, right? These people are
so bad, wanting to have a family and wanting to be moral and wanting to work out and go to church. It's so bad, right?
Right. But I could see potentially that growth leading to, you've talked about Operation Gladio and glowies. I've talked with Orthodox people that believe like there's been some strange people that have come to services that they weren't never before, and kind of and trying to keep track on this. And potentially if as Father Turbo Qual says, you can't be a Zionist and be an Orthodox Christian based on some of the things that have come out from the papacy and the general growth of Christian Zionism and Protestantism. I could see a future where we're the only one that aren't like Zionist, and that could be used as a sort of threat to the establishment to some sort. But obviously it's not going to win in the end, because according to at least all the saints and the elders, there's going to be a massive golden age of Orthodoxy. And I've talked with multiple priests on this channel, and they believe what we're witnessing now is just like the beginning of this process. So
yeah, I mean, I hope so. And yeah, that's definitely possible that you could have some sort of a reaction where Christianity in America ends up split between Orthodox Christianity and then some sort of weird but the thing is that one reason I wouldn't be too concerned with that right away would be the Catholic version of their Novus Ordo weird statements about
not converting
Zionism, I guess we could say post-Vatican II.
Not converting certain groups.
It's even that's not like, that's pretty divorced still from like the evangelical dispensationalist attitude.
Yeah.
And so I don't know that you could link, like, I don't think those groups would mesh too well. That wouldn't be a very, I mean,
well,
maybe they could have some
misfit patriot or something, like claim to be a Catholic, didn't even know the Nicene Creed, like.
But I mean, I can't really see like John Hagee and all of his crew, like, with a bunch of Roman Catholics. It just doesn't seem like that would work too well. But, who knows, 20, 30, 40 years, a lot of these entities might not even exist anymore. They might just literally just die out with no new converts.
I suspect Protestantism will, for all intensive purposes, die out within the next century. I just cannot see how that's going to survive. It brings very little to the table in regards to sacraments, mysticism.
Well, also sterility. Like, you're not going to have young families.
Yeah, it's the oldest cohorts of Sunday attendees. I did a stream. It was like in America, it was Buddhists, Hindus, Orthodox Christians, and Muslims were like the only group that the average attendee was below the age of 40.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So
yeah, nobody under 40 wants these dead, sterile Protestant churches, which are like hanging giant, rainbow and BLM banners everywhere.
No.
Like, who wants that? Nobody wants that.
Rough Hands renewed his membership for 23 months. Says epic comeback stream duo. Let's go. Thank you very much, Rough Hands. Shout out to Sarah from Goose for becoming a member. Shout out to Holland the Goods for becoming a member. Shout out to H. Brassy for renewing his membership. Jay and COTEL doing the deed. No Diddy. It's cracking. Thank you very much.
Well, I got a question for you.
What's up?
So I'm going to do a stream tonight. It was going to be earlier before, but I forgot I had to do an interview with John Heers today. So I moved tonight's Giza pyramid stuff. Everybody's talking about the Giza pyramids and the columns and all that. Now, you did a stream about Göbekli Tepe.
Mm-hmm.
And did you make it members or something? I can't find it.
No, it shouldn't have been.
Okay.
I think it's still on the channel.
because I tried to search it, I couldn't find it. Maybe it's titled something different, but
yeah,
I want, because I know in your stream you talked about how there's not really any evidence of this being made by tech or whatever. It could just be human. I think that's what you're arguing, right?
Yeah.
I wanted to clip that and talk about that on tonight's stream. But tonight I'm going to be talking about the claims about the pyramid, what the evidence may or may not suggest. I'll also be talking about some of these other megaliths and ancient civilizations and this kind of stuff, because I haven't talked about that in probably 5 or 6 years. So,
what are your thoughts on the Giza pyramid findings?
it's interesting. I still can't discern how legitimate the claims of the underground tunnel things are, because I keep getting conflicting data. I've looked at it for like 2 days straight, and Grok keeps contradicting on it. I can't tell whether that's just wild conjecture or if it's actually there. So it's not in the original paper, but now supposedly the same people from that paper have a new paper, which is not yet peer reviewed, but they're making these claims. So if it's true, it would suggest totally different history of that region, and maybe even like Nephilim type stuff, if it's true. But it may not be true. So have you looked at it at all?
I've been looking at it a little bit, but like you, I got just in my cursory search, this was a couple of days ago, I started to see that there was a few exaggerations from what I was seeing by people online about it.
Okay.
And they were, they were a little bit more conspiratorial. So they immediately went to Graham Hancock, lost civilization, ancient technology, that type of worldview. And it leads, at least from them, what I'm hearing is the narrative that it leads credence to like the pyramids being like pyramids of energy, and that these coils that are amongst these,
that seems like a huge, that's like it's a giant battery or something. I don't know about all that, but like if there's structures, I mean, that could suggest, just a whole other underground city or something like that.
And that's where I've done streams on like ancient aliens and stuff like that. And, I think that there's a lot of natural explanations. I think that the ancients weren't as totally ignorant as we think they are.
Right.
And if we watched I think that they thought in such a larger time frame. And we think of building a pyramid, we like expect it to be done within 2 years. Like we have these people are thinking in generations. And so
they would think about cathedral building for 100 years.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's medieval. That's, so we're talking ancient period. So, but, what do you feel like Graham Hancock sort of, let's just speculate, if there's this sort of redating, because everybody wants to go back to the 12,000 year period. So when Göbekli Tepe, that's the whole thing, is like, oh, we had advanced human civilization. Yeah, fingerprints of the gods. There you go.
So I was going to cover fingerprints of the gods. No, yeah, so I think that
the astrotheology of how it lines up with Leo, and
I think that it's fun and interesting to speculate, and I think everybody has a phase of where you read Graham Hancock and you get into that stuff, and I did too in my 20s. I do think there's genuinely mysterious things that we don't know how they, megaliths and lost cities and underground civilizations and all that. That stuff does get. In fact, there was one I don't know if you saw that recent one in China was pretty mind blowing. There was a village in China, and they had this ancient sort of water well that was kind of pouring water out of a rock, and it was not that big of a like cistern type thing that had been there, and everybody in the village just knew it as, oh, that's the ancient water well. We don't even know where the water comes from. It's just the ancient sacred water well. So they drained it somehow, and then they brought in this team of archaeologists and all this, and they started digging around it, and they found tunnels, and they found an entire underground city. Wow. With giant columns, not as giant as the Egyptian columns, but pretty amazing. Like this, and it's so old, nobody knows what it is. Like the Chinese are like, we don't even know. Nobody remembers. You know what I mean? So I do think there's these fascinating instances of stuff like this, of lost civilizations, and like you said, like there's no reason to jump to aliens or any of this nonsense. And most of the people who are claimants of that kind of stuff, like Eric von Daniken, and these people are frauds. You know what I mean? Like they've been exposed as frauds. So, but I do think it's possible. If I was to admit anything, if the Genesis 6 narrative and if the Titan narrative that's in some of the deuterocanonical texts is true, it's possible that the Book of Enoch is describing a period when you had aberrations in the ancient world that perhaps required worship and human sacrifice at these sites. And that is what led to a global flood. So if these ancient civilizations had this thing going on, I mean, Plato talks about Atlantis he doesn't mention giants or tech, but he says you have this ancient civilization. It was destroyed like that. God flooded it. So you've got a lot of attestation to, global flood myths in China.
Right. And that's where Hancock and Randall Carlson, Randall Carlson is essentially proven, and he's a New Age guy. He's into like the sacred geometry, but he has shown that there was a massive global flood that happened, and that's just a historical fact. And it wasn't some regional thing. Like I think with the typical narrative of like the archaeologists was that these floods were like regional events. He's saying, no, this was massive. This like covered all like aspects of North America. This was not a regional flood.
Yeah, at the beginning. Well, Fingerprints of the Gods, he talks about early on, like down where the Nazca lines are, is it Peru? That the Peruvians have a flood myth as well, and they had this prophecy of this teacher who, after the Great Flood, told them to live righteously and don't kill each other, and kind of giving him a basic kind of 10 Commandments kind of morality. So, I think it's okay to speculate within reason, about this ancient, because I just feel like we don't really know about the ancient world.
No.
So.
And so many sources have been corrupted, and there's been a historical narrative to reframe things that have happened. So it's so hard to like fully get a grasp of the ancient world and like what they were capable of, what they could do, what they couldn't do. But it is fun and exciting, sort of leading edge thought of like rediscovering our past. And maybe it wasn't what we thought it was. But what I feel, and I'll move on here, but I've never seen anything regarding some of these ancient legends that actually contradict a biblical worldview. If anything, it typically reinforces it. It's just that so many people are new age that are into these topics.
Yeah.
They immediately go to the ancient alien thing or some type of, advanced technology. Yeah. But if you're just a traditional Christian, you're like, a lot of this stuff kind of fits in it totally in accord with my worldview. I don't see where you have to appeal to all this stuff.
Yeah, there's ancient Chinese flood myth, which is at the beginning of the I Ching, right?
Yep.
There's
the Gilgamesh legend.
Gilgamesh epic. I remember in Bible college we talked about how there's a flood story in Gilgamesh epic. So it's fascinating that, and then you have Peruvian flood myth as well. So, I mean, it makes me think of another section in the Graham Hancock thing where he talks about, you've heard of the Piri-Reis map, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, just speculating here, like if that map really is describing some different, underlying land underneath the ice, I mean, perhaps a giant flood is what changed that. You know what I mean? Like, to me, a lot of these things sound like a flood would explain a lot.
Yeah, exactly. We'll have to check out your stream tonight. That's going to be pretty fascinating because I have not done a full deep dive. I came up to conflicting narratives. I was like, okay, maybe this stuff was just overhyped. I'm not sure.
Well, what do you think about Göbekli Tepe? Like, I remember the claim is that like some of the rocks are cut in a way that they couldn't do back then or something.
Right.
Like that. Okay.
Yep. And that they basically, this was technology that was superior to what they had. And then the carbon dating, which even then carbon dating isn't like rock solid proof. But according to some of the carbon dating and stuff like that, they are saying that this is the best site to push back the time frame to 12,000 years ago. And that's why Graham Hancock is so adamant about that particular site, because that if it is true, because he has some scientific credence to redating that site to potentially 12,000 years ago. If that's the case, and he believes that they built an entire city and then buried it, which I'm not quite sure how that makes a lot of sense, but that's why they claim it's so preserved. And there was a guy that I listened to that recently went on Rogan. This was maybe within the last 6 months, but he claims that there's like a huge effort in Turkey to no longer excavate any more of that site. And then the theories abound. Is it because of it totally reshapes ancient history, or is it because if they keep it partial, they make more money through tourism that wants to come and like see it? I don't know. It's debated, but he recently was bringing this up. I think he's the guy. I forget his name, but he's done a lot of stuff on Atlantis and like arguing that it was that place inside the Sahara Desert. If you know what I'm talking about, there's here, let me pull this up. So Google Maps, if you go to bam, in Mauritania, if I go here to like the layers here, there's this right here. So you see this like massive circle.
Oh, this would be the concentric circles.
Yeah, so he claims this is actually the city of Atlantis. And so they've done work here. Now, it's really hard to do any research because it's literally out in the middle of the Sahara, and it's super hard to stay out there for long periods.
Right.
But this apparently was all underwater, or at least the water was around it at one point.
Huh.
And so there's been multiple archaeologists, and this guy has a large YouTube channel. He's been on Rogan. He thinks and makes the affirmative claim that this is Atlantis right here.
Huh.
So
I did not know. I'm not. Have you seen some of these claims of like they found a giant pyramid? I think in Serbia.
No, I have not looked into that.
Yeah, that was interesting because, and the reason I think that I'm going from memory here, but the reason I mean, it may not be Serbia, maybe somewhere Macedonia. I remember, but somewhere in that region, and because the thought was, well, pyramids and ziggurats are not Caucasus stuff. That's Middle East, or ziggurats in Latin South America or whatever. But if there's ziggurats, or excuse me, if there's a pyramid in Serbia, that would be pretty interesting, wouldn't it? That in terms of the ancient world. And then there's another. I'm split on the one in Antarctica because I'm talking about. There's a claimed pyramid there, which sometimes when I look at it, I'm like, it's just a mountain, and then from other angles, it's like that looks like a pyramid. Like, yeah, I don't know what that is.
I saw something. Wasn't like the largest pyramid ever found was recently in like Indonesia or something.
Oh, really?
I thought it was in Southeast Asia, and this was. I thought it was like a. I think if you did a YouTube or just an internet search, it'd pop up, but it was a Southeast Asian country. I can't remember exactly, but it looked like it was part of a mountain, but it turned out to be like what they believe to be as a man-made pyramid, and supposedly it's the largest one that's been found.
Oh no, I didn't know that. So let me see. Bosnian pyramid claims. The mystery of Bosnia's. Now this is actually in even like mainstream normie.
Right.
This is Smithsonian. Let's see what they say, because I knew I'd read about this. I'm not sure how legit they take it to be. They might be debunking it, but Visoko Bosnian pyramids. That looks like a pyramid. I mean, that does not look like a mountain if you look it up.
Right.
I mean, from certain angles, that looks like a straight up like.
Well, and in China, I went to the Terracotta Warriors, which is in Xi'an, the ancient capital of ancient China. And when I was there, just within like the last decade, so I was there, I went there in 2012, and they had said within the last decade, it was discovered that what looked to be, it just looked like a big hill, turned out to be a man-made structure, and that they had buried an emperor, and they recently through sonar and stuff, because they can't go in it because they believe it's booby trapped and has all these poisons and stuff, because it's apparently, according to them, it's filled with terracotta warriors, soldiers that were close to the emperor, and a bunch of treasure inside. But they believe, based on their understandings of these structures, that it's like booby trapped, and if you go in there, there's poisons, mercury, all types of stuff to try to kill somebody if they were to try to take any of the treasure. But yeah, that was, I mean, that's in the 2000s. right next to a major museum in China, and they just realized that a big hill was actually a man-made structure.
Huh.
So
they also found something recently too in one of the Latin South American countries. Like it was an Aztec or like a Maya or Inca, like a giant underground tunnel network that had never been discovered before. It's pretty recent.
Oh,
I got to find that one of the Chinese village though, because that one's the craziest. I think. Oh, this might be it. It's called the Long Yu Caves. Have you heard of this? I think this is it. Let me make sure.
Caves.
Longyu Caves. I think this is it. Yes, this is it. So it was just some village, and then just drained the water, and they found this giant underground structure. I don't even think they know like what it is.
Oh wow.
Like what? Like who? You know, it's just forgotten. Like nobody remembers or knows like what emperor said, "Build me this cave."
Wow. Yeah, I think that all that ancient, it's fascinating. I think there's definitely a story that has yet to been told to what exactly happened and how all these structures they do, and that's the whole thing with Graham Hancock's point, is that all the ancients worship the stars, and so all this stuff has to do with like astrological symbolism and influence. And he kind of has a new age spirituality where they're harnessing the power of the stars,
right,
and all this different stuff. But
yeah, I mean, I'm not into the like.
No. But I think he has a point that there is some type of connection amongst all these ancient
it's
groups of
definitely
people building these structures. There's clearly a phenomenon here.
It's definitely an astrological like worship alignment type of thing.
Right.
Would you
absolutely
agree?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that. And the fact that they are all over the world. I mean, the Easter Island statues are still unexplainable. They don't understand how the hell they built those like weird statues of guys they're found like in the ground. They're ginormous. So
are they just heads or full bodies? I don't even know.
Full bodies.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, they've excavated some of that stuff, and they're ginormous, and it would take hundreds and hundreds of men to try to pull those across like wooden, like lumber, like timber. You know, you lay timber down to try to roll it across it. I mean, they're huge, and apparently they're all made in one piece. So,
oh, well, that reminds me of the. Have you seen that? I think it's maybe, I want to say Serbia again, but there's this place where there's like these giant stones that kind of go out into the water, and it's like it's a road.
Yeah. Are you talking about Japan?
It may be Japan. I can't remember. But they don't know how it got there, but it looks like it was a giant road.
And they look perfectly. Yeah, they're like perfect rectangles, and with sharp edges. It was like, how the hell?
Huh.
Yeah, and I've heard I think Graham's speculation is that when the Great Flood happened, all this stuff went underwater. Before it was actually above water.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. People are saying we're getting into Billy Carson territory.
No, dude. I mean, we're getting into Bible Genesis territory.
Exactly. I think that's what's happening is as you know, as time goes on, it's like the Bible's actually being proven to be more accurate than anybody supposed. So AC, shout out to you, brother. Throws in $50, says you may share this with Jay, even though he is a quantum KGB sorcerer before the KGB went defunct. Thank you so much, AC. David James.
There's no KGB anymore, but people still say that, you know, if you're Orthodox, you're like tied to the KGB, which is.
I know.
I mean, the KGB has been 35 years defunct, so.
Well, some of the stuff that people make up about you is just hilarious. And man, and
well, you're going to
people say that you're mean, but some of the people you debate with are so incredibly dumb.
Yeah.
That.
Well, we got a big debate. Hey, we got a popular person debate Wednesday. I'm going to be debating. Do you know Dasha from Red Scare?
Oh yeah. Oh,
so
what you guys debate?
She wants to debate Eastern Catholic versus Orthodox.
Like, oh my gosh!
So that'll be Wednesday.
She has no idea what she's getting into.
I'm gonna probably troll her. I'm gonna like.
Is that on your platform?
Yeah, I told her she'd come on the channel. Yeah.
Oh my
So
God.
I'm gonna like make up stupid questions and like assert stupid stuff that they don't believe, like just to mess with her. I'm gonna say, well, you know that Eastern Catholics believe in eating weed on one of their holidays, right? I'm just gonna mess with her. No, we don't believe that.
Holland the Good throws in 10, says, did Lawrence of Arabia wear Cosby sweaters and have a gay lisp?
If you watch the Gertrude Bell movie with Nicole Kidman, Robert Pattinson plays T.E. Lawrence. So you can go watch Robert Pattinson being Skittles and determine whether you think he has a lisp.
Austin Tertulio throws in 5. Thank you very much, brother. Brendan Turner throws in 5, says, Brits keep saying they can take back their country because look at the Spanish Reconquista, but the Spanish elites weren't pro-Islam. They might be cooked. Yeah, I think we discussed that. It's going to be tough for Britain. I mean, I think at least based on percentages, Germany still has a chance if it stopped like in the very near future and corrected course. But France and especially England, I mean, England at the percentage now, I think it's almost 20% of the country.
Mm.
I mean, it's that you just imported it.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. But
like, I don't know. God bless them, though. I hope.
Yeah, I mean, could you turn it back? I don't know. It's a good question.
I mean, you couldn't without deportation, and
right.
I think
they're not going to do that.
Yeah, I can't. I don't see a single European nation outside, Hungary or Poland, and that'd be in a local regional area. But I don't see any of them like deporting anybody. So I don't see how they're going to turn it back. It's just not going to happen. Josiah throws in 20. Thank you so much, brother. He says, God bless you and Jay. You are both changing the world more than you know. God bless you. Well, thank you very much, Josiah. We're humbled.
Appreciate that.
H. Brossi says, what's STG stand for?
I don't know.
So STG, Jay has the best normitard Americanism man voice. I don't know why a goofy ass mocking voice makes me laugh so hard when I heard it a million times.
Oh, I think he's talking about one of my normie. When I do the normie voice, is what he's talking about.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, H. Brossi. And Jehovah's Thickness renewed his membership. Thank you very much. Says, Jay talked about trauma. Do either of you have a stream specifically covering on whys and hows of trauma is useful? I'd pay for it, but I'm poor. I do not have anything on trauma specifically.
Yeah, I mean, Jamie and I've done. We got a bunch of old archive streams about trauma-based mind control. Yeah, we got a bunch.
Great. So go check those out. And the best way when you're trying to go to Jay's YouTube channel on a desktop and click on the search and then because if you just search Jay Dyer and the topic in the YouTube search bar, multiple videos do not come up. You have to go to the channel and search it. Yeah. So if anybody's looking for old stuff, that's
how you know what your Gobekli Tepe stream is called. I can't find it.
When we get off, I'll go back through my channel and send it to you.
Because that's an example. Like when I search, I can't find your thing on that.
And it may have. I'll find out which stream. It may have been titled something that was related to ancient history. So when we get off, I'll go back through my channel and look. H. Rossi throws in another 10, says it's only a partial antidote to degeneracy. I think he's talking about Islam. The young men seeking out Islam think it's more base because they can coom with multiple wives. Under that view, that plus abhorrence of Protestantism. Yeah. I mean, and you've talked about this. I mean, Islam is appealing to like primitive senses in man, right? So you get like, it kind of has like prosperity gospel.
Yeah.
So then, Allah's rewarded you with money. So now you can have 4 wives. And if you want, you can, if you're in Shia, you can go purchase a woman for a day. It has all types of stuff that's about like worldly.
Well, I mean, let's not forget the most obvious of like people, very young, underage.
Oh, yeah.
So
Aisha.
Well, but I mean, PDF stuff.
Oh, yeah. In general. Yeah. The normalization of that in general. Yeah. Was it the Bachi boys of Afghanistan?
Well, those are actually pagan, but.
Oh, they're not Muslim?
No. I mean, I'm sure they tolerate it, but I'm pretty sure like the Taliban was opposed to the dancing boys.
Well, good. H. Browsey said, I know it's not necessarily either of you guys' place to answer this, or maybe just don't know, but it seems to me that the Western Europeans may have lost this slow burn war. Thoughts? Well, I think we've already addressed it. I don't know how, and Jay already said how they're going to turn this tide. And I don't see the gumption to do any mass deportation or totally change course. So the best they could do is just close off immigration. But there's so many people, it's already changed the fabric of the country.
Yeah. So I looked it up. The practice is like an ancient, like a more of a pagan thing in Afghanistan, and Islamic law has tried to ban it. I'm not saying that makes Islam good. I'm just saying, like,
well, you know, one of the things I found interesting when I was doing a stream on the trans stuff was that Iran is like the world leader in surgeries.
Yeah, we covered that.
In their theology, as long as you transition, it's not a sin.
It's actually a world hub for that. Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, wow.
I mean, people need to understand, like, especially dumb right wingers that think you can have the alliance with all these wacko. Like, I mean, Shia beliefs are crazy. It's not. It's like, okay, so rabbis have a crazy philosophy. Oh, I guess that means Iran and Shia are good. It's just crazy.
Exactly. No, and yeah, and they read that. You know, I see these people will read like. They'll get in like the traditionalist school and read one book on Sufism, and all of a sudden they're like, no, Islam's like super cool, dude. It's like Neoplatonic. And it's like, no, have you looked into like the religion of it? Like not just some Western portrayal of like Islamic mysticism. Like it's totally incorrect.
I mean, it might be, yeah, it's true that like Sufi and, you know, Shia Islam is Neoplatonic, but that doesn't mean that it's bathed and tried and good.
Yeah, exactly. H. Brossi said, I'm not trying to be mean, but ex-prostitutes will never stop running through those Protestant church doors. They need to shield their past.
Yeah, they're figuring out like it's a grift, right?
Right.
Like Nala, people like that.
Yeah. Yeah, Pastor Nala. Giving her dad her OnlyFans money. Bitter Klinger says, can Jay give us a John Hagee talking about the Nephilim and pyramids in impersonation?
Friends, in my book, In Defense of Israel, I prove that the Nephilim set up the pyramids, and they did it to fight Israel with a giant Giza Death Star.
Oh, that was great. Snaggle Beast renewed his membership, said, have either of you done research on Dodgerland? The ruins under the North Sea lends credence to the food narrative for sure. I've never heard of
the food narrative. You mean the flood narrative? No, in fact, I welcome everyone suggesting these cities and things and megaliths, because what you find is that there's infinite of these. Like, there's so many discovered cities and civilizations and megaliths. I can't even keep up with all that. I got a stack of books on them, and I can't even keep up with them. Dog or land.
Interesting. No, I am not familiar with this. And somebody was saying that the YouTube channel that I was mentioning that was on Jay Dyer and talked a lot about like the Atlantis being in the Sahara. I believe it's called Bright Insight. It's a useful YouTube channel because it really gives you he gets very deep into that worldview. So he's a very major proponent of Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson. So he's taking their line of thought, but he's kind of always staying on top of the latest research and papers that come out. So it may be useful for research on streams. And then H. Brossi says, if this stuff with the pyramids is true, you do realize where the brothers and sisters are going with that, right? Your cube used to be his big ass brain to do it.
Well, y'all saw my post, right? I know what that energy system was for.
Yeah, growing
the hydroponics up in there, right?
That's right. That's how they talk to Anubis.
Dank-a-Naughton right there. That's what that was for.
Next one, Dave throws in $2. Says, has Jay heard about Egyptians in the Grand Canyon?
Yes. So there's an old news article clipping that supposedly someone had found reference to or a suggestion of Egyptian hieroglyphs in the Grand Canyon. I don't know the provenance of that news clipping. One thing I will say that's pretty fascinating, and I learned this from Jamie because we were driving when we were on our way to Vegas. We went through this area, I want to say around New Mexico or Utah. I don't remember exactly where this was, but there's this place where there's a throne carved into stone out in the desert, and it has these Hebrew letters on it. And can you guess who faked that?
Mormons?
Yes. So, I mean, if there's a Grand Canyon thing with, I mean, I might be tempted to think the Mormons staged that because they've done it in other places to prove the Mormon story of the Hebrews in Utah or whatever. So, but I mean, then again, maybe there is some stuff we just don't know about. I don't know.
Bill Hicks says, epic stream, guys. God bless. Thank you very much, Bill. Nathan, we was kings back in Egypt. We was kings. And H. Brossi throws another one, says, just to get a step closer to the goal. Every time you guys stream, it's great. I hope the masses will remember y'all in the eschaton for the number of catechumens you've brought to the faith. Well, God willing. And then we just had a couple over on Dono Chat. Chat TBD. Anyone here understand hypotheticals? I think everybody here understands hypotheticals. Random
That's
user.
the one I always ask the Muslims.
Well, and Andrew asked all these girls about whether they ate breakfast in the morning, how they'd feel if they didn't eat it.
Yeah.
No, it's amazing how people can't, like, they do not understand generalities,
right?
Or
how to restate a hypothetical, or even just restating what your argument is.
Yeah, per capita seems to go over people's heads quite a bit. Random user said, could I beat Jay Dyer in a live debate? Yes, but only under specific conditions. Chat GPT real response.
I don't think ChatGPT and Grok are that great in debates. I mean, we've been doing some videos experimenting with how good they are at debating, and they're not that great. So, I mean, I found Grok to be the best because it's kind of like an easier version of Wikipedia that's not as lib as Wikipedia. So, if you're asking Grok basic questions about, when did, when was James Hughes Angleton the CIA desk chief in Rome? Like, he can give you those kinds of things, but beyond that, it's not that great.
Have you noticed any significant difference between Grok and ChatGPT?
Yeah, I think Grok's better.
Okay.
I mean, I haven't used ChatGPT in a few months, and it was pretty weak sauce, dude. Like, I remember asking some questions, and it, like, ChatGPT of 3 or 4 months ago was literally contradicting itself within like 5 minutes on the same question. I'm like,
right,
you just told me this, but I found Grok.
Well, and you can get it if you respond. If you ask it a question, it responds, and then you are critical of the response, saying, "Oh, well, you missed this." Like, you can get it to sort of go off into error.
Yeah,
kind of coach it.
And I mean, Grok's the same way, but I found it to be a little better.
Okay,
I got him to even admit, like, Grok was even like admitting stuff about Victor Ostrovsky's book. You know what I mean? So it was pretty
interesting.
Yeah.
Judeo-Islamic guy says, the Islam talk here reminded me, I've heard it said several times that the modern world for religion was invented for British colonialism. Not sure how that works. I'm not bigly educated.
Well, I mean, the modern world is created more or less by the British Empire. That's true.
I don't know. Nickname, first name says, haven't seen you both in a minute. What have you guys been up to? I've been trying to finish my dissertation. I'll be turning that in next week. So I think I've only streamed like once or twice this month besides this.
I know. Yeah, I noticed you haven't done a whole lot. And
just because I've been writing and formatting and getting all that stuff done. So April, I'll be back into the normal swing of things. But you were just you were in person in Texas. Didn't you just go to Texas?
Yeah, we were there for a funeral, and then I went ahead and did Lord Voldemort's show. But also I was finishing Esoteric Hollywood 3 for the last few months. So,
oh, nice.
So I got that complete. I got the rough draft back from the editor and publisher, and yeah, hopefully it'll be out in the next couple months.
Oh, that's awesome, man. That's got to feel good.
It was a weight off, and it was because I hadn't really been writing a lot in the last 5 years. I've been doing so many podcasts and videos that getting back in the mode, and I'm sure you're experiencing that too with your dissertation. Like if you do a lot of podcasts and videos, then you try to switch back into writing. It's like a totally different mindset.
Yeah, it's a totally different. Yes, it is. And that's why for me is like to do that stuff, like I just have to be engrossed in it for days at a time. Yeah. I was trying to write and like stream a day or do research for a stream and then do it and then try to go back to it. It's like you can't have so many thoughts go through your head because then you lose track of all the threads that you're writing about and trying to weave together. It's a totally different thing. And then last one on Dono Chat, Outside One says, thank you both for the great work. Curious how Russia play into utilizing its Islamic factions to influence /warfare into destabilization efforts. I ask as characters like Dugan speak about flooding Europe with Africans. I've never heard. Is Dugan just describing what's happening, or I don't think Dugan ever advocates for flooding Europe with Africans.
I don't know if he said that. I mean, I've read Dugan's books. I'm not a regular follower. I don't keep up with all the stuff that, Dugan talks about. I mean, I think because I talked to him 8 years ago, people assume that I'm just for like,
right. But that's how the KGB nonsense comes from.
Well, I mean, I'm critical of he has kind of Gnostic influences in his positions and perennialist influences, and I've never been interested in those positions. So I think he's interesting to read, and he's interesting to hear his views on stuff. But I would imagine that the way Russia projects influence and power is not the same type of ways that the West does it with total open borders. Maybe if you look up active measures, that's kind of been their approach to this stuff. If you listen to Mark Hackard and the interviews that we've done, Russia's limited in its capabilities of what it does in foreign espionage operations. I mean, they have illegals, they have units and spies that do things like every other country, but I don't think they have the kind of capabilities of what the democratic establishment in America claims that they have, right? Like the Democrats, well, they're running everything. They've got Trump and they've got, Elon Musk in their pocket, and they're all, you know what I mean? It's just these outlandish claims at the same time as the same Democratic media is like, Russia's collapsing, they're losing the war, they're bankrupt, but at the same time, they're like running Donald Trump. Like none of it makes any sense. So, I mean, I don't know if they have any plans of pushing open borders, but I guess it's possible, but I don't know.
Seems like Russia would be a natural nationalist ally if the sort of globalist world order, if Trump truly was getting out of NATO and getting out of the enterprise of empire building. I saw that at least according to reports, they had that 2.5 hour conversation that they wanted to establish direct flights between New York and Moscow again and open up tourism. I think that'd be great if they could get that done.
By the way, when I mention active measures, I'm not referring to the documentary that is supposed to prove that Donald Trump is a Russian agent. I'm referring to the actual plan from like how Russia views its intelligence capabilities that they call active measures, which is it ranges from media to specific actions of black ops, this kind of stuff. And then like, because of that term, you had people latch onto that term and say, oh, we'll see, that means Putin's involved in compromising Donald Trump and making him an operative. But it goes back to Soviet intelligence as to one of their plans of how they engage in subversion. But one of the things that was mentioned maybe 10, 12 years ago was that because Russia is not as powerful as the West, they don't have the ability to engage in all the same types of operations that NATO and the West have. Mm-hmm. So one of their strategies has been to push more truth-based narratives, and that's why you'll see a lot more of say RT, for example. I mean, they're more banned and censored in the West since the war, but prior to that, you notice that RT was pushing a lot of the same stuff that Lord Voldemort pushed.
Right.
And that's because the idea was that it's more effective to just go after truth-based narratives in terms of journalism versus the way that America runs its international disinformation networks and campaigns, which requires a lot of lying, a lot of money, a lot of, international Reuters, AP, like all this stuff, which turns out junk. That takes a lot more money and power and effort to run a giant network of disinfo. And so Russia's vantage point was that it's more effective to run truth-based narratives versus massive disinfo like the West does.
Right. Well, and to your point, I think I saw a clip of Tucker Carlson recently interview like Rick Sanchez or somebody used to be on Fox News or something. And now he had like he's Cuban, conservative guy, American, but he has a show on RT and he was talking about how they don't censor anything that he wants to talk about.
Yeah.
And that RT, he said he was surprised once he joined, had his own show. I think Larry King's on RT still. That like they are huge. RT is huge in places like India and like other parts of the world, Central and South America. Yeah. RT is ginormous. And so he was talking about how it's if your message is to get globally, meanwhile it's banned here in the United States, but right. He was talking about how it's the only media company he's worked for that does not curate your show or your message. It gets back to your point is like they allow people to have dissident information that's truthful. And it's built up a credibility in which the RT is trusted and incredibly popular in different parts of the world.
Yeah, so that's a better strategy from their vantage point if you're a smaller player versus a larger Western player.
Yeah, makes total sense. H. Brossi threw in another one, said, have y'all seen the Sneeko video with that sheik? Please watch it. If not, you see firsthand why they have no arguments and don't understand ours. Yeah, we mentioned that earlier about exactly. Apparently Sneeko had no idea he had to believe in the Hadith. Austin,
which is weird because people have been bringing up for a good while now, like, your Islamic beliefs are more than just the Quran, right? I mean, it's like people have been.
He was getting criticized, if I remember right, like during live streams, because he would be openly critical of things in the Hadith, and then Muslims that follow him would say, "Oh, you can." He'd be like, "No, I don't question the Quran. It's just the Hadith. You think he'd give an example. You think that's real? You think that's factual?" And then then he talked with the sheikh. He's like, "Who are you to judge?"
Well, this is what you get. This is what these idiots are going to find out the hard way. Like, maybe you should have done a little more investigating and heard out some of the opponent's positions before you jumped into this dumb cult.
So, last super chat is H. Brossi again. Thank you so much, brother, for the generous support today. Say, I've come to the conclusion that the tiny hats make the right decision by not proselytizing. They can't get past the theophanies in the Old Testament and might suffer the same online embarrassment as the Muzzies. All right.
I mean, I don't think the rabbinic philosophy and believers are very interested in debating. They don't. Every now and then there's one who will, but it's very rare. But I thought that Sam Shamoun's recent debate with that young Orthodox British Jewish guy was pretty good debate, and the whole debate ended up being about all these theophanies. So,
right. And then Flanums throws in 5, says, always enjoy when DPH and Jay do streams together. Well, thank you very much, brother. And Jay, I know that you got to go do his stream. Apologize.
I moved back a little bit, so I got to eat dinner, and then we'll have the stream after I eat dinner. But yeah, thank you for having me. It was a great conversation. I was glad to stay long.
No, I appreciate it because the overview you did on that 4th hour on InfoWars, that was the best cover, and you did it so you only had, because the breaks, you only have like 30-40 minutes, and you hit on all these points about why Islam is dangerous, how it's been used as a subverting force, and why it's coming to take over in a militaristic way Western Europe, and they're not going to be able to stop it unless they wake up.
Yeah.
So,
thank you.
And then Orthodox Boomer Grandma just threw in 20, says, thank you guys, thank you. And then H. Brosy said, it's only right that I get past the line. Well, thank you very much, H. Brosy. So anyways, guys, that's going to do it. Jay's going to be live here after he eats dinner, so go over to Jay's channel. And we'll be watching him talk a little bit about the latest on the Giza Pyramid. So God bless you guys, and I will see you in the next one. As always, until then, God bless.